All right, everybody, thank you for being here. I want to kick things off with a little bit of a history lesson. Ready? Does anyone remember this thing? 5, 6, 6-ish people? So this, and I'm not allowed to move, so I have to be very stuck here. So this was Phantom.js. I don't know when that was, like 10 years ago, 11 years ago. I was terribly excited about this because it was one of the first JavaScript-driven projects that allowed me to control a browser. And JavaScript people like myself went nuts with it and was like, okay, now I can scrape things, I can screenshot things. The entire front-end community kind of went all in on this because it was JavaScript, you were able to control headless WebKit and kind of opened up this whole browser tooling space for me. Let's continue. Does anyone know what this is? Casper for once. So that was a layer on top of Phantom.js. You see, we had a thing for ghosts at the time, and it was basically the idea, let's use Phantom.js to build up an end-to-end testing suite using headless WebKit and kind of start establishing end-to-end test flows. And these were the things when I started doing end-to-end testing for the first time using JavaScript, using headless browsers. So let me quickly introduce myself. I'm Stefan. I'm here from Berlin. I work for a company that is called Checkly. We're also based in Berlin here. We do synthetic API and browser monitoring, and this leads me to talk about Playwright because we also offer that running in the cloud wherever we want to, and this means that I can play a lot of times with browser automation. And I'm also a Playwright ambassador, which means I have fancy Playwright socks, which is always cool. So this is me, and I'm from Berlin, and I write a tiny newsletter. If you're interested in front-end news, stop moving, Stefan. In front-end news, so Web Weekly email, I send that out once a week if you're into front-end stuff. But let me tell you, in general, I always thought and still think that the idea of end-to-end testing is great, right? Because you can test your front-end, you can test your hosting, you can test your database, the entire stack. You can mimic that the behavior that your users will have when they visit your products and sites. But to be fair, when I wrote my first end-to-end tests, it was terrible. Honestly, I didn't enjoy it very much, and the worst spot that you can be in when you start end-to-end testing and you put a lot of effort with your team into it, sprint over sprint over sprint, you're working on this, and then you end up with something like this. That you have a test suite that runs 30 minutes an hour, that you don't enjoy writing because it's so painful, and then at the worst stage is that you want to push out this one typo fix to production, your end-to-end test running an hour to give you false positives, and you run it again. This is the situation that I had for several years, like 10 years ago. I was not very happy, my team was not very happy. Also, engineering management wasn't very happy because your team or the team spent a lot of time end-to-end testing just to be slowed down. That didn't make a lot of sense. Eventually, you might come up with a solution to this problem. So we sat together that as a team multiple times was, we should only run our tests on demand, right? When we do a big refactoring, when we do a huge thing that really makes us uncomfortable. And let me tell you, this is the moment when all the sprints and all the effort and all the work that you put into your end-to-end testing stuff goes out of the window. Because when you're not testing constantly, when you're not updating your tests, at some point you will just say, okay, this is too much work, let's put it up. Over the time, though, I think things got a lot better, right? Google invested in Puppeteer to control Chrome. Was a solid step. Then Cypress appeared 5 years ago. With solid developer experience, it kind of felt like Cypress took the entire space in a few years. It was a very, very nice experience. But you might have guessed that already. I do think that there's a tool from Microsoft here that the communities are not talking about enough, and that is Playwright. And I think it's 2 years old. A little more, getting a nod here from a Playwright core member. So it's 2 years old, and let me just give you a brief introduction of what Playwright is, why I think it's great for end-to-end testing, and then I'm going to do a little bit of demo to show you all the goodness that comes with it. So first of all, Playwright is cross everything. Chromium with Edge and Chrome, You can control this. You can use WebKit with the Safari. You can use Gecko with Firefox. It works on all 3 operating systems. And you can write it in 5 programming languages, so JavaScript, TypeScript, .NET, Python, Java. If you're running in a not JavaScript language, you can write Playwright too. I'm a JavaScript hipster, right? So I use JavaScript and TypeScript. If you're in the Microsoft universe and you're using VS Code, there comes a VS Code extension, which means when you're using VS Code to debug your applications already, it's just another button there that you can use to control your headless tests. Speaking of developer experience, it comes with very, very solid typings, right? I do enjoy it when I don't have to read docs, when I can just plug away, tap, 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 and my editor is telling me when I mess things up. So kudos to the Playwright team, because I think the typings are very, very nice. And now that I'm using Playwright for over a year, it took me actually a few months to realize that Playwright is not just a puppeteer competitor, because it is way more than a browser control. So Playwright these days comes with all the test goodies that you're expecting from the testing software that you already have in place. You have test hooks, you have expect functions, assertions, describe, before each, after each. All this thing that you might be already familiar with is included. And speaking of these long end-to-end tests that run for an hour, parallelization is built in. So you can set a command line flag, you can tweak it in your config. Running multiple browsers at once in different processes is pretty much just a config step away. And it is built for quick execution. So when you think about the idea of end-to-end or UI testing, what is it? It is find an element, do something with an element, find another element, and wait for this element to have a certain state. This is pretty much UI testing. And what that usually meant is that you had to place several wait for statements all over the place, right? Wait for this button to be there, click it. Wait for this modal to be there, do this. All this functionality is built into Playwright itself. So for example, when you see there this button click, what this is doing under the hood, it is waiting for this element to be visible, actionable, not moving. There are a few checks that are happening, and you will find in Playwright a lot of patterns where you're dealing with asynchronous behavior that looks synchronous, right? This is not a button click. This is waiting for this button to be visible, actionable, and then clicking it. The same goes for the assertion below there. This is not a single moment where you check, hey, is this thing right now hidden? It is Playwright waiting for this element reaching the state to be hidden. So what that means that you can drop a lot of wait for statements and you can just instruct Playwright, hey, this is what I want to do. This is the state that I expect. And this leads to less flaky tests, and you can just give it to the framework, right? It will figure it out and will time out if the UI doesn't reach the state that you're expecting it to. Another thing that I do enjoy very much is the fast release cycle. So once a month there's a new video and a new version, roughly once a month. And there hasn't been a single release over the last 6 months where I was not like, this is actually pretty nice. I was waiting for that, and this is good additions. So and as I'm now 8 minutes in, I think showing is better than telling, so let me just take my clicker away and let me walk you through how you can set up a Playwright project, how we can start testing stuff, and let's see how I will make it through this session. And I don't see my mouse. This starts great. Okay. Is that big enough, or can I make it a little bit smaller for the people in the back? Does that also work for my sanity? Okay. So what we have here on the right is my terminal, and I will instruct Playwright over there, and what we have here is a standard Playwright project. I will close everything out. So there's a Playwright config, which you get when you bootstrap a new project. And here, if you wonder what this little facepalm thing is, this is just my backup in case I mess it up. And then we have a test directory that includes Playwright spec.js. When you have Playwright installed, you can, over the command line, do npx playwright test. And what we are running against is this site here, which is the Playwright docs. It is not running on the internet, though. It is on my local host. And I don't see my mouse. That is a little bit annoying, but we see how this goes. And then we have a test file here that requires test and expect from Playwright itself. And in the before each, we're already navigating to localhost 8080. So the first step to get started with Playwright is pretty much just by using something that is called CodeGen. And this, when I saw this for the first time, really blew me away. So what you see here is now that we started a browser session, and I have what is on the right side, the Playwright inspector. And what I now can do is I can just start clicking around here and check out what is happening on the right side. So I'm opening the Algolia search, I'm closing the Algolia search, I'm going back to home. And here we have our first Playwright test. All that I can now do is I can go back to my terminal. I can call that, and here I have a test that is called random click around, right? So let me just paste that over. Let me close the navigation, save that. And congratulations, we just recorded our first Playwright test. So what I now can do is I can run npx Playwright test, and just to show you what is happening here right now, let me just run in head full mode so that we see all the browsers. So when we kick this now off, we see the Chromiums appear, we see the Firefoxes appear, we see the Safaris appears. It's all the browsers running in full mode here right now, testing the website, my local host 8080. And you see it here right on the happening or on the right side. But you see that, well, this test was now failing. And why is that? Well, for the test cases of mobile Chrome and mobile Safari, when we look at the site that we're actually testing, well, the nav bar is behind a hamburger or behind a button, right? So this test is failing because we're running on a mobile viewport. To fix that, let me just quickly go to the Playwright config. Here we have the configuration for all the browsers that we have. And I will just go on with Chromium going forward, which means when I now run the tests again, let's run in headless mode, we should have 5 tests that are easily passing and everything is good to go. I already briefly showed you the show report. So every Playwright test here comes with a report, which you then can use to really have a look, hey, what is happening, what is failing, what is my test really doing? But this is actually only the beginning. So let's have a look in my notes what should be next. What else do we have? We have the VS Code extension. So I'm using VS Code. You see that I have a few little triangles here. VS Code debugging is your kind of jam. You can always do debug tests. And what you now see is that you can reuse the debugger of VS Code if you want to. So we have access here to the variables, to scoping, all these kind of things. So if you're using VS Code for debugging already, I think this is a very nice experience. So we see here we're on Playwright library. We're now on the Algolia window. So I think that's a nice way to debug your stuff if you have more complex or longer tests. I have to admit though, that I do prefer to debug my tests outside of VS Code. So what I tend to do is I spin up the same tool that we already saw. So here we also have the debugger that we can use to kind of have a look and what my test is doing. And what I think is cool is when you're running Playwright debugging, you will see that Playwright is actually telling you, hey, this is going to happen. And I'm interacting with this element. So that makes it very reasonable to have a look at what is going on. There we have that. And did anyone use Playwright already? A few people. What was one of the most requested features of Playwright?
One of what?
Of the most requested features of...
Regressive?
What?
You said regressive?
Requested.
What did people want?
What did people want?
I don't know. I wanted a auto-replay.
What is autoplay?
Auto-replay is like Cypress does. When you change the code, it automatically reruns the exact.
Well, there was a release last week. This is now here. So what you can do is you can run npx Playwright tests with a UI flag, and now you have a UI flag element. So basically, I hope I understood you correctly. There's now a native UI for Playwright. And what you can do is you can enable the watch mode here, and whenever you save something, Playwright will continue running, right? So when I now do this, you can have this watch mode and can run your tests without running it manually all the time. So you can then dive into this. You see all the instructions. I think it's a beautiful way. And what still astonishes me is that when you see these preview windows in the Playwright tooling, this is not a screenshot here. This is actually an HTML snapshot, which I think is pretty decent. Oh, pretty cool. All right, so with this, I just covered very quickly the tooling of Playwright, but I think it should be that we should kick it off and should start actually some tests. So let me just go on and let's kick off a CodeGen session again. And what I want to do is I want to test the little toggle here, right? If dark mode works properly. So I'm copying both selectors here. I have here a test that is called toggle correctly. And I think there's a bug in the Playwright docs because the text here is not changing after I clicked it. That could be that is my local installation, but when you're doing headless testing, especially if it's visual, what you usually want to do at some point is you want to do screenshots, right? I don't see myself doing that often with Playwright, but let's say we want to do home dark PNG here, and then we want to have another screenshot for home light PNG. So when I now run this, px Playwright tests, we should be able to go to my directory, and here we have the two screenshots. Right? This is not as exciting, but what comes with Playwright 2 is what you can do is you can also tie this to assertions. So let me just use an await expect, which comes from Playwright itself on top. And what we can do is we can give it the page object, and we can say to have screenshot over here. And this is built-in visual regression testing coming with Playwright. So when we now say that we expect here to have an image that is called home dark PNG, and we want to do, and we want to have home light PNG over here, I can remove these two images that I just used for debugging right now, and we can actually do some visual regression testing right now. So when I go on and I do npx playwright tests, this should fail initially, not because I made a mistake, but because this is visual regression snapshot testing. And right now, because I just kicked it off for the first time, there's nothing to compare it with. So when I now run this command again, we should have some passing tests over here because we did successful visual regression. Here we have the two screenshots that we just took. So here we have the dark mode, here we have the light mode, and just to prove the point that this is actually working, let me just open that up. Let's make a little bit of art without AI here, but I'm just going old school. Let me just do this. So I'm just editing the snapshot here right now, which means now when I run my tests again, I should have a failed visual regression because, well, yeah, I filled it with the image, right? It's telling me, hey, these pixels are right now different. Please have a look. This can be very interesting when you do component testing, when you do layout testing, if these kind of things are important to you. I think this is just a very handy, nice little gimmick. But what if you, for example, do an e-commerce store and you have some dynamic data in there, right? Something that the carousel, that marketing controls, or something else. What you always can do is you can also go in and you can start masking out things, which I found to be very handy for, especially when you do screenshots. So what I do is I add a mask property. I will go here, I will do update snapshots so that my little drawing will disappear. And when we now have a look here, we just blurred out something so that it's not messing with my visual regression testing. This can be very handy, again, for these kind of carousels, whatever you have, what has a fixed size. It's not only about pages, though. If you want to do components, so DOM elements, and want to screenshot these, you can do that too. So let's just grab the H1 and say to have screenshot headline PNG. And now what we have here is that I'm also taking screenshots on a component level. So here we have the fancy headline. So I think this is just a very nice way. But I wouldn't say that you need these for headless debugging, because I will show you some more tools to do headless debugging. But if visual regression is your kind of jam, I think this is a good way to do these kind of things. But what I want to show you next is how you actually can handle all this auto-weighting and all these assertions to not rely on wait for statements. So when I go to my little website here, this is localhost, right? That's playwright.dev running on my localhost. I brought in a little Easter egg. Ta-da! Because more sites need more confetti, in my opinion. But even though it's a little bit overused, because it's this one library everybody uses, but I need something better. If you know something better, let me know. So what we do is we locate the headline, or we locate, the way that the confetti works is that the JavaScript library injects a canvas element, draws all the confetti, and at some point it will remove the canvas element again. So how would you now test that? You could now start adding, I'm waiting for canvas element, I'm waiting for this, and how do I do this? In Playwright, this is all pretty streamlined. So what we want to do is we want to wait, expect, then we have the canvas locator that locates the canvas element. So we do, all right, we expect that there is no initial canvas element, first of all. Then we say, okay, we want to click the headline. So let's click the headline. And now, I'm just duplicating the logic here. And even though this looks very streamlined, right, this is asynchronous operations. It's checking, it's waiting for the state of no canvas being available. It's clicking the button, it's waiting for the state of one canvas being available, and then it's just waiting for the state that this canvas disappears eventually. This means that I can write really streamlined end-to-end tests without being bothered about all this logic to figure out when an element shows up or when it disappears. So I hope this works. You see that the test is now taking a little bit longer because the animations take a second here. So let me just prove to you that this works. So let's do this again. So I should now have a faulty test here because, well, there won't be two canvas elements. And what happens now is that this second condition to have count 2 is timing out. It's blowing up your test. So this way you can write very streamlined tests. So 2 more. If you're doing a lot of end-to-end tests, for example, against staging or production environments, there might be a situation where you want to start blocking resources, right? If you run your end-to-end tests against a staging or production environment, you maybe don't want to load all the images. Maybe you want to break or not make your marketers unhappy because you're running so many headless tests and you're showing up in all the tracking and everybody wonders why there's so much traffic on the website. You can always hook into the network layer with event handlers. So what you see here is that I have a page on response handler, and what I always can do is I can go in. The test is called high quality, so I want to check that I don't have any 300 or 400s or something in the page. Then let's just grab the resources that are with these status codes. Let's push them to the array. Let's create the array because we don't have it yet. Here we go. And now, because my tests are currently structured that I'm already navigating to localhost 8080 over here, I have to do a reload because otherwise that won't work. Usually you would restructure your test a little bit if you want to do this. And now I can do expect not found to have length 0. So let's see how this goes. So I'm kicking off another Playwright test. And as you see, well, if you do websites have save as, right, you usually don't get all the stuff. So my Playwright docs don't have high quality here right now, but I'm not showing you how I download and debug source maps of all the JavaScript that is included in the page. So let me just mark this test as fix me, fix it later at home, maybe not, and run the test again so that we are all green again. And then in very rare occasions, when you maybe want to do some custom logic that is not included in the Playwright framework itself or with the functionality that you want to do, what you always can do is just for completeness reason, because I'm kind of a perf person and maybe I want to evaluate what the largest contentful page is in a certain website. If you need something custom, you can always use page evaluate to push on some custom JavaScript into the session that you're currently running. So what I'm doing here is I'm injecting a performance observer just to get out the metric, largest contentful page, because maybe I want to put it somewhere, maybe I want to monitor that. Yeah. So and then you can handle back. So it's important. This context here is inside of the headless browser session or the browser session, and then you can pass it back to the Node Playwright context over here. So let's just do a quick assertion here. And I'm doing very poor number casting here because currently it's a string. To be less than, we're talking milliseconds here, and I'm working locally, so let's have a look what comes out here. Bam! Yeah, the confetti test is slowing things down, that is correct. I think let's just check if this works when we're going with a very low number. Cool. So, largest contentful paint, testing my own local website here is 150 milliseconds. No surprise that it's super fast. But let's go with 500 here. So I think these are all nice, very nice mechanics to test your stuff itself. But what was previously always a challenge is when you run your tests in CI/CD, right? How do you debug this stuff? And how do you debug? It's like the typical it works on my machine problem, right? This is the moment where usually, especially in a headless world, where you're like, I don't know what's happening. So if you run these cases and you run Playwright in CI/CD or for monitoring, what you can always do is you can use something that is called a trace file. And I like to think about it as time travel debugging, actually. With the default configuration, trace files, as you saw, will only be created on first try. We are currently here not in a process env CI setup, so we don't have this set, which means I'm just turning on trace files. And now check this out, because I think this is very cool. Whenever you now run a trace, I just configured that we want to run traces, and a trace file is pretty much a zip file, right? So what should you do with this? Playwright comes with a tooling for that, so you can always do npx playwright show trace. So let me just pick up the trace file for the random click around. So remember, this was generated when I ran this particular test case. Usually you want to have that in CI/CD and was like, hey, your test failed, here's some information. So when I now call show trace, here we have our test run. It includes the timeline of the things that were happening. So here we see, okay, we navigated there. Here we have the Algolia window showing up for just a second. Here we have all the actions that have been taken. This is recorded. We have the similar state here, right? This is again a website, an HTML snapshot. So this gives you the tools to really debug what happened. Why did things fail? So this is just the time travel debugging. All right, this went wrong. And this is what we have to fix because we reached this state. I think this was all about the live demo here, so let me just wrap it up very quickly and see how I am on time. Pretty good. So, Playwright in a nutshell. I showed you a lot here right now, so I think it is a very decent tool. It's wonderful to work with. So it comes with auto-weighting, so that you don't have to do wait for statements. It comes with web-first assertion, screenshots, test runner, retries. I didn't cover these too much. Tracing, the VS Code extension, the inspector, the debugger, code gen, image snapshots, and for everybody waiting for watch mode, there's now the new native UI, which makes writing Playwright tests much, much nicer. If you're curious or if you want to learn more about the Playwright universe, because I'm doing it at work, I'm publishing almost weekly Playwright tips on YouTube. I'm still discovering the nitty-gritty details about Playwright and what is happening, so you can expect a weekly, maybe every second week, depending on the workload. But overall, I think when you want to test end-to-end, usually there is no silver bullet, because sometimes you have applications that are just tremendously slow. Sometimes you have applications that have different edge cases. It really depends on what you're dealing with to write your end-to-end tests. But after doing Playwright now for over a year, I can tell you, I honestly think that is a very, very, very good solution. And it's way easier for me than all the things that I used before. But I do think that we as developers, or the front-end crew, we should also start treating our UIs like we do our APIs, right? So running your end-to-end tests, for example, on deployment is, I do think, only part of the story. Because when we, for example, if I'm building an application and I'm using a third-party API, what is the first thing that I probably ask about? What's your SLA? What's your availability? How many nines are we talking about, right? For APIs, this is very, very common standard. But I'm also a heavy internet and website user. How often do I click around in a SaaS product, in a web app, and it's like, oh, this is broken, isn't it? And then it works the other day. I think, here's my hot take for today, I think that entire web applications should be tested end-to-end all the time, just to guarantee that everything is working. And would love, honestly, would love to see status pages that are not only describing APIs, 9999999, but we are confident that 999 times of 1,000, my front end is doing what it is supposed to do. And it's also getting a little bit more tricky, right? So I'm in the SaaS business for quite a while. Usually you use a third-party vendor for login, Auth0, right? Or you use this tool for this tool. You use another tool for another thing. Other downtimes very, very quickly can mean that you are down too. So and this is why it's important to monitor your applications end-to-end all the time. If you want to learn more about how you could impact or figure out what third-party scripts in your website have an effect on your own production sites, I wrote a blog post about that. But overall, yeah, I think that end-to-end monitoring should be your safety net, because I'm one of these people that deploys stuff and then doesn't sleep well because I wonder, hey, this serverless function is running for 2 years. Is it actually working? I'm kind of this person, and end-to-end monitoring helps with that, and it helps with to start shipping with confidence. And here we go, 30 minutes. Thank you, everybody. I'm Stefan.